So my answer was correct. It was Michael Jackson. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice. I would like for you to number your paper from 1 to 5. You are going to be inferring your answers, and then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about them together. So you're going to be pausing your video a lot to be talking about our answers as we go through this. So just be prepared for that. All right. So let's look at our first inference. So my first statement says, Miss America of 1921 stood only 5 feet 1 inch tall. With which of the following statements would the author be more likely to agree? And I've got two options here. Option 1 reads, in 1921, judges thought tall women were less attractive than shorter ones. And then my second option is Miss America of 1921 was shorter than winners of more recent years. I'd like for you to pause your video and choose which option you think is your correct answer. Now that you've chosen your answer, let's talk about it. So my inference is actually that the second option is correct. I really don't like that in the first option, it's talking about all women. In my statement, I only see that this is talking about one woman, the woman who won Miss America. So I don't think it's really fair to say that it's talking about comparing women. The other thing that I see is this word only. When you say someone is only 5 feet 1 inch tall, that really kind of tells me that there's something singular and something special about that person. So that's why I ended up choosing the second option here. All right, number 2. In February of 1984, Bruce McCandless II, aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger, floated free, untethered into space above Earth. My question is, what can you infer about McCandless's personality? I'd like for you to go ahead and pause your video and make your inference. So now that you've made your inference, let's talk about it together. When I read this, there's a couple of things that stand out to me. Mainly that he floated free and untethered into space above the Earth. That means a lot to me. That means he's floating unhooked to anything out in outer space. That to me tells me that this man is brave. He has courage. Maybe he's adventurous. And I think a little bit crazy too, because I think you may have to be just a little bit crazy to want to just float in outer space without anything connected to you. I know that there are so few people that have been to space that alone takes tremendous courage to be able to do. So that's how I make my inference for this one. All right, let's do number 3. Number 3 reads, at the turn of the century, Henry Ford pioneered assembly line manufacturing. And I actually have 2 inferences I'm going to make for this one. The first one reads, can you infer which century the author implies? And the second reads, what particular assembly line product did he pioneer? Pause your video and make your inference. So now that you've made your inference, let's go ahead and answer our questions. The first thing I look at is which century the author implies. I know that a century is 100 years. And when we talk about the turn of the century, that's when we move from the 90s of a century to the zeros of a century. So my clue really for this one has a lot to do with manufacturing. Manufacturing as a whole has not been around that long, just a couple of hundred years. So I feel like it's a pretty safe bet to say that this happened in the 20th century, which means we're looking at the 1890s through the 1900s. That's my turn of the century. The second question asks us, what assembly line product did he pioneer? So my clue for this comes entirely from his last name. His last name is Ford. I know that one of the largest and longest standing car companies in the United States is Ford. So that's why I'm going to make my guess that the assembly line product that he pioneered was the process for the car itself. So let's look at number 4. Number 4 reads, radio became the most common communication medium in 1920. 3 decades later, television came along. Here's my question. what would you infer about the sale of radios in the 1950s? Did they increase or decline? So I'd like you to go ahead and pause your video and choose your answer. Now that you've chosen your answer, let's talk about our inference. I know that decades talk to me about every 10 years. So when we have 3 decades after the 20s, we end up in the 1950s. So my thought is that radios declined in the 1950s. And I'm going to use a lot of my prior knowledge for this. I know that currently radios are not as popular as TVs. And I also know that when new technology comes out, that new technology usually takes the place of older technology. So that's why I think I am going to choose decline here as my inference. Okay, let's do our last one, number 5. Number 5 reads, a woman walks into a hospital clutching her abdomen and cursing at her husband, who trails behind her carrying a large bag. So, our inference asks, what is wrong with the woman? Go ahead and pause your video and make an inference. All right, so there are 3 clues within this text that tell me what inference I should be making. My clues are that she was clutching her abdomen, cursing at her husband, and that she had a large bag with her. So my inference is that this woman is pregnant, and a lot of it has to do with the bag. So when you are going to the hospital, you're not generally going to pack a bag if it's really truly an emergency. You're just going to go right there. So the fact that her husband is carrying this bag for her tells me that this was a planned trip, like a surgery. But that, in addition to the fact that she's cursing at her husband, tells me that this is something that they had kind of worked out together. So definitely a pregnancy. All right, so the last thing that we want to talk about here is how we're actually making these connections. Inferences are things that we do a lot of the times without even realizing we're doing it. So what we want to talk about are the 3 types of connections that we make. The first type of connections are story clues. These are when you take parts of one story that you start with, and by the end of the story have learned something to help you answer a question. So the information you're finding comes directly from the story itself. The second type of connections we make are what are called text to self. This is when we connect something we know to be true to information we read in the text. That's a lot of what I did with the Michael Jackson reading from earlier. Because I knew that information already, I was able to make that connection. And the third type of connection that we have here is called text to text. This is something that we use mostly with social studies. When we talk about text to text, what we're doing is we're taking our prior knowledge that we have of other texts and connecting it together with information that we are reading that is new. So social studies is all about making those connections between different things to improve our understanding. So the last thing that I want to leave you with is that a text is not complete without the reader. You are a huge part of every reading that you do. The author can only take you so far. They can only suggest things. True understanding comes when we take those author suggestions and we make our own ideas from them. That's that skill of inference. So just remember that you are just as important as the author when it comes to doing a reading. So this week we have a lot of practices with inferences. So on Monday we have some vocabulary. On Tuesday we have an inference practice. On Wednesday we have capitalization. I know we've been doing a lot of it, but there's a lot of rules. On Thursday, we have a longer inference reading that asks us to make sure we're finding proof inside of a text. And on Friday, we have another pictograph practice. As always, everyone, please remember that you can email me, remind message me, or just send me a message on email and I'll get back to you with any questions you have. Good luck, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye, everybody.